The external auditor presented 7 material weaknesses in our financial controls to the board. Revenue recognition timing issues, inadequate segregation of duties, insufficient documentation for cost capitalisation decisions. My CFO told the board these deficiencies stemmed from gaps in my oversight as financial controller. I'd documented every single one of those issues in quarterly risk assessments sent directly to his office starting in January. 8 months of detailed memos outlining the exact control weaknesses the auditors had now independently identified. 8 months of recommendations for remediation that had been acknowledged and ignored. The auditor's report specifically cited concerns raised by financial operations staff in Q1 and Q2 2023 that were not adequately addressed by management. They'd interviewed me as part of their fieldwork. They'd reviewed my risk assessments. They'd cross-referenced my flagged issues with their findings. When the CFO presented his response plan to the board, he characterised the audit findings as unexpected control gaps that had emerged due to rapid growth and inadequate monitoring at the controller level. He said my team had failed to implement proper review procedures, that the weaknesses reflected insufficient rigour in my financial oversight. He presented this narrative to the audit committee while the lead auditor was still in the building. The same auditor who'd spent 3 hours interviewing me about the memos I'd sent. The same auditor who'd asked detailed questions about management's response to my flagged concerns. The same auditor whose report would be presented to the board immediately after my CFO finished his carefully constructed explanation. I didn't interrupt his presentation. I sat in my office and waited. Because when someone blames you for problems you documented months ago, and the independent auditor has copies of your documentation in their working papers, the truth doesn't need a defender. It just needs an audience. My name is Rosalie. I joined Precision Components Corporation in March 2021 as financial controller. We manufactured precision-machined parts for aerospace and medical device companies. Annual revenue was around $400 million. The company was privately held by a group of institutional investors with a board of 6 directors. My role covered all financial operations: monthly close, financial reporting, internal controls, cash management, and coordination with external auditors. I reported directly to the CFO, Warren Hastings. Warren had joined Precision 6 months before me. He came from a larger manufacturing company where he'd overseen a successful operational turnaround. The board brought him in specifically to prepare Precision for either acquisition or IPO within 3 to 5 years. That meant building scalable processes, strengthening controls, and ensuring clean audits. For the first 18 months, the work was intensive but functional. We implemented new accounting systems, documented procedures, hired additional staff, and passed our annual audits without significant findings. Warren was demanding but competent. He set clear expectations and stayed out of day-to-day operations as long as deliverables were met. That dynamic shifted in late 2022. Precision won a major contract with a European aerospace manufacturer. The deal was structured with aggressive delivery milestones and milestone-based revenue recognition. Finance would need to track completion percentages, validate technical deliverables, and recognize revenue in alignment with accounting standards for long-term contracts. The contract added roughly $80 million in annual revenue, but it also added complexity to our revenue recognition process that our existing controls weren't designed to handle. I raised this in a meeting with Warren in November 2022, right after the contract was signed.
We're going to need to enhance our revenue recognition procedures, I said. Milestone-based recognition requires more documentation and validation than our current process provides. What specifically are you concerned about? Warren asked. We need engineering sign-offs confirming milestone completion before we recognize revenue. We need clear evidence that technical specifications have been met, and we need segregation between the people validating completion and the people recording revenue. Can your team handle that? We'll need to add headcount, and we'll need engineering to commit to providing formal completion documentation within 5 business days of each milestone. Engineering is already stretched. I don't want to create administrative burden that slows down delivery. The alternative is recognizing revenue without adequate support. That creates audit risk. Let's implement what we can with existing resources and see how it goes. If we run into issues, we'll adjust. I documented the conversation in a memo to Warren and saved it in my risk tracking file. The first milestone revenue was recognized in January 2023. I reviewed the supporting documentation. Engineering had provided an informal email confirming completion. There was no formal sign-off, no detailed evidence that specifications had been met, just a brief message saying the milestone was done. I flagged it in my monthly financial review with Warren. The revenue recognition support isn't adequate, I said. We need formal documentation. The email from engineering confirms the milestone was complete. That's sufficient. It's not sufficient for audit purposes. We need documented evidence that specific technical requirements were satisfied. Rosalie, I understand your concern about process, but we can't let perfect be the enemy of good. The milestone was completed. Engineering confirmed it. Revenue was earned. We recognized it appropriately. I'm going to note this as a control deficiency in my quarterly risk assessment. That's fine. Document your concerns. But we're not holding up revenue recognition while engineering builds out formal completion processes. I drafted my Q1 2023 risk assessment in early April. It was a formal document I prepared every quarter, summarizing control weaknesses, process gaps, and areas requiring management attention. I'd been sending them to Warren since I started at Precision. The Q1 assessment was 8 pages. I included detailed sections on revenue recognition controls from milestone-based contracts, specifically the lack of formal engineering sign-offs and inadequate documentation to support technical completion. Segregation of duties issues where the same individuals were both validating milestone completion and recording revenue transactions. Inadequate review procedures for cost capitalization decisions on the aerospace contract, where costs were being allocated to inventory without clear engineering validation that work met contractual specifications. Each section included specific examples, references to relevant accounting standards, and recommendations for remediation. I sent the assessment to Warren on April 12th with the subject line, Q1 2023 Financial Controls Risk Assessment. His response came 2 days later. Received. Will review and discuss with Ops leadership. We never discussed it. By Q2, the issues had expanded. Precision had signed 2 additional milestone-based contracts. Revenue recognition was happening across 3 major projects, all with the same inadequate documentation. Engineering was now actively pushing back on requests for formal completion sign-offs, saying they didn't have time to create paperwork for milestones they'd already finished. Warren's position was consistent. We were recognizing revenue appropriately based on the information available. Formal documentation processes would be implemented eventually, but they couldn't slow down business operations in the meantime. I prepared my Q2 risk assessment in July. It was 11 pages. I added new sections on expanding control weaknesses as milestone-based revenue recognition scaled across multiple contracts without corresponding process enhancements. Increased audit risk given the volume of revenue now being recognized with inadequate support. Specific recommendations for immediate remediation, including hiring a revenue recognition specialist and implementing mandatory engineering sign-off requirements. I sent it to Warren on July 18th. His response, noted, "We'll address these in the next fiscal year planning cycle." I saved his response and continued my work. The annual audit was scheduled for September. Our external auditors were a regional firm called Kensington Associates. The lead partner was a woman named Margaret Frost. She'd been auditing Precision for 4 years. Audit fieldwork began the first week of September. Margaret's team spent 2 weeks on site, reviewing transactions, testing controls, and interviewing staff. I was interviewed for approximately 3 hours over 2 separate sessions. Margaret asked detailed questions about our revenue recognition processes, particularly for the milestone-based contracts. "Walk me through how you validate that milestone completion before revenue is recognised," she said. "Engineering sends an email confirming the milestone is complete. We review the email and record the revenue. Is there formal documentation showing that technical specifications were met?" "No, just the email confirmation." "Who validates that the email is accurate?" "No one independently validates it. We rely on engineering's assertion." "Is the person confirming milestone completion the same person who benefits from the revenue being recognised?" "Sometimes. The project managers who confirm completion also have performance metrics tied to contract delivery." Margaret made notes. "Have you raised concerns about this process?" she asked. I paused. This was the moment where I needed to decide how transparent to be. "Yes," I said. "I've documented concerns about revenue recognition controls in my quarterly risk assessments to the CFO." "Can I see those assessments?" I provided her with copies of my Q1 and Q2 risk assessments. She read them carefully. "These are very specific," she said. "What was management's response?" The CFO acknowledged receiving them, but indicated that process improvements would be addressed in future planning cycles. "So these issues have been flagged for 6 months and haven't been remediated?" "Correct." Margaret continued her fieldwork. Her team tested multiple milestone revenue transactions and found the same pattern: inadequate documentation, lack of segregation, insufficient validation procedures. The audit findings were presented to management in late September. Margaret scheduled a meeting with Warren to discuss the results before they went to the board. I wasn't invited to that meeting, but I received a summary email from Warren afterward. The email said the auditors had identified several control deficiencies that would need to be disclosed as material weaknesses. Warren's email characterised the findings as arising from rapid growth and operational complexity that outpaced our control environment. He said we'd be developing a remediation plan and that he'd be presenting to the audit committee the following week. There was no mention of my risk assessments, no acknowledgement that these issues had been flagged months earlier. The audit committee meeting was scheduled for October 5th. Warren was presenting. Margaret would present the formal audit findings afterward. I wasn't scheduled to attend the committee meeting. Controllers typically weren't included unless specifically requested. On October 4th, the day before the meeting, I received an email from Warren with the subject line, "Audit Findings Response, Controller Responsibilities." The email outlined his planned presentation to the audit committee. It included a section titled,
root causes of control deficiencies, that described the issues as resulting from insufficient monitoring and review at the controller level, inadequate implementation of control procedures despite management directives, gaps in financial oversight that allowed process weaknesses to develop without escalation. I read that section 3 times. Warren was framing the audit findings as failures in my execution rather than failures in his response to my documented warnings. I didn't respond to the email immediately. Instead, I opened my risk assessment files and reviewed exactly what I'd sent him and when. Q1 assessment, April 12th. Detailed description of revenue recognition control weaknesses, sent directly to Warren. Q2 assessment, July 18th. Expanded description of the same issues with specific recommendations for remediation, sent directly to Warren. Both assessments specifically identified the exact control weaknesses that Margaret's audit team had now found. I drafted a response email to Warren. Warren, I've reviewed your presentation outline. I want to clarify that the control deficiencies identified by the auditors were documented in my quarterly risk assessments sent to you in April and July. Those assessments specifically flagged the revenue recognition issues, segregation of duties concerns, and documentation gaps that appear in the audit findings. I recommended remediation actions at that time. I'm available to discuss this further if needed. I read the email twice, then decided not to send it. If Warren was going to blame me to the audit committee, sending him a defensive email wouldn't change that. It would just alert him that I disagreed with his narrative. Instead, I forwarded my Q1 and Q2 risk assessments to my personal email account. Then I sent a brief note to Margaret Frost. Margaret, I understand you'll be presenting audit findings to the committee tomorrow. I wanted to confirm that you have copies of the quarterly risk assessments I shared during your fieldwork, as they may provide relevant context for your presentation. Margaret replied within the hour. Yes, I have your Q1 and Q2 assessments. They're referenced in our working papers and will be part of our discussion with the committee. Thank you for the reminder. I went home and waited. The audit committee meeting started at 9 a.m. on October 5th. I was at my desk working through month-end close procedures. At 10:30, I received a call from the CEO's assistant asking me to come to the boardroom. The audit committee wanted to speak with me. I walked down the hallway to the executive conference room. When I opened the door, I saw Warren sitting at one end of the table. Margaret was at the other end. 3 board members sat along the sides: the audit committee chair, Thomas Brennan, and 2 other directors. Thomas gestured to an empty chair. Rosalie, thank you for joining us. We have some questions about the control deficiencies identified in the audit. I sat down. We've just heard presentations from both Warren and from Margaret about the findings, Thomas said. There appear to be some conflicting accounts of when these issues were first identified and what actions were taken. We'd like your perspective. I glanced at Warren. His expression was neutral. What specifically would you like to know? I asked. Warren indicated that these control deficiencies emerged over the course of the year as the company scaled revenue from new contracts. He suggested that your team didn't implement adequate monitoring procedures to keep pace with that growth. Is that accurate? No, I said. I identified these specific control weaknesses in January when we began recognizing milestone-based revenue. I documented them in quarterly risk assessments sent to Warren in April and July. Each assessment detailed the exact issues the auditors found: inadequate documentation for revenue recognition, insufficient segregation of duties, and lack of validation procedures. You documented these concerns in writing? Yes, in formal quarterly risk assessments.
Thomas looked at Margaret. "Are these the assessments you referenced in your presentation?" "Yes," Margaret said. "Miss Chen provided us with copies during our fieldwork. Her Q1 assessment from April specifically identifies the revenue recognition control weaknesses we found. Her Q2 assessment from July expanded on those concerns and recommended immediate remediation." Thomas turned back to me. "What was Warren's response to these assessments?" "He acknowledged receiving them, but indicated that remediation would be addressed in future planning cycles. He didn't want to implement controls that would slow down operations." "Did you escalate these concerns beyond Warren?" "No. He's my direct supervisor. I documented the issues and sent them to him as required by our risk assessment protocol." One of the other directors spoke up. "Why didn't you escalate to the board if you felt these were material issues?" "I documented them in the formal risk assessment process that management is responsible for reviewing and addressing. I'm the controller, not the CFO. I don't have direct board access for operational concerns." Thomas looked at Warren. "Warren, did you receive these risk assessments?" "Yes," Warren said. "And you didn't address the issues Rosalie flagged?" "I believed we were managing the risks appropriately given our resource constraints and operational priorities. I didn't view them as material deficiencies at the time." "But they are material deficiencies," Thomas said. "Margaret's audit report classifies them as material weaknesses requiring board disclosure." "In hindsight, yes. At the time, I made a judgment call about prioritization." Margaret spoke carefully. "For context, the issues Ms. Chen flagged in April would have been significantly easier and less expensive to remediate at that time. By September, when we conducted our testing, the volume of inadequately documented transactions had grown substantially. The remediation effort now is considerably larger than it would have been if addressed when first identified." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Rosalie, do you have copies of these risk assessments?" he asked. "Yes, I can provide them immediately." "Please do. Send them to me directly within the next hour." I nodded and stood to leave.
"One more thing," Thomas said. "Going forward, if you identify material control issues and don't receive adequate response from your supervisor, I want you to escalate directly to the audit committee. We're establishing that protocol effective today." "Understood. Understood," I said. I returned to my office and sent Thomas copies of both risk assessments, along with Warren's brief email acknowledgements. Then I went back to my work. The board scheduled an executive session for later that afternoon. I wasn't included, but I heard through colleagues that Warren had been asked to leave the building during their discussion. At 4 p.m, I received a meeting invitation from Thomas Brennan for the following morning. The subject line read, "Financial Controls Remediation Planning." I attended the meeting at 9. Thomas was there, along with the CEO, the head of operations, and Margaret Frost. Warren was not present. "Rosalie, we've reviewed your risk assessments and discussed the audit findings at length," Thomas said. "The board has decided to make immediate changes to financial leadership. Warren Hastings is no longer with the company. We're asking you to assume interim CFO responsibilities while we conduct a search for a permanent replacement." I didn't respond immediately. "I'm willing to do that," I said finally. "But I need clarity on authority. If I'm going to be responsible for remediating these control issues, I need direct board access and the ability to implement changes without operational leadership overriding financial controls for convenience." "You'll have both," Thomas said. "You'll report directly to the CEO and the audit committee. You'll have budget authority to hire additional staff,
and you'll have full support to implement whatever controls are necessary to address the audit findings. Then I accept. The meeting continued for another hour, discussing immediate priorities, hiring a revenue recognition specialist, implementing formal engineering sign-off requirements, segregating duties between operations and accounting, and developing a comprehensive remediation plan for the audit committee. Margaret provided recommendations based on her firm's experience with similar situations. The CEO committed resources. Thomas made it clear the board wanted aggressive action, not incremental improvement. I spent the next 6 months rebuilding the control environment Warren had neglected. I hired 3 new staff members, including a senior revenue accountant with contract accounting expertise. I implemented mandatory engineering documentation requirements and worked with operations to create templates that wouldn't burden their workflow. I established monthly control testing protocols and direct reporting to the audit committee on any deficiencies identified. The following year's audit, in September 2024, had 0 material weaknesses. Margaret's report specifically noted the significant improvements in controls and the strong remediation response. The board offered me the permanent CFO position in November 2024. I accepted. My compensation increased by 60%, and I was given an equity stake in the company. Warren landed a CFO role at a smaller manufacturing company about 8 months after leaving Precision. I saw the announcement in an industry newsletter. I didn't reach out. But I did keep copies of those quarterly risk assessments in a dedicated file. Not because I needed them anymore, but because they represented something important. Documentation matters. Escalation matters. And when you identify risks in writing, those warnings don't disappear just because someone decides to ignore them. Warren stood in front of the audit committee and blamed me for control failures I documented 8 months earlier. He characterized my oversight as inadequate. He framed the audit findings as gaps in my execution. He did this while the auditor who'd reviewed my assessments was sitting in the same room, preparing to present findings that directly contradicted his narrative. The timeline was unambiguous. The documentation was clear. The auditor's testimony confirmed what I'd written months before the audit began. That was all it took for the board to understand what had actually happened. I didn't need to defend myself. I didn't need to argue. I just needed to make sure the people with decision-making authority had access to the same information the auditors had. The rest resolved itself.